Hey there, friends and enemies. JoPaWrites here again, and today I wanted to give my personal ranking of all the various boss fights in Remnant 2 based on a couple different factors. Keeping in mind, this is my own personal opinion based on fun factor, how challenging they are across different difficulty levels, and how unique the mechanics are when you're facing that boss. So let's jump right into it. I'm also going to keep story in line a little bit, but that's not really going to be a primary focus. So we have Farron and Phelan. This one is interesting because it is two sides of the same coin. I think this is a solid boss. These are solid boss fights overall. They're pretty much firmly in the A tier. I like all the world bosses specifically because they add something different. I do like that you have to make a choice on which of these bosses to fight. But as far as the fun factor, I think they're pretty equal overall. Now, that is only because I do find that the Nightweaver is my favorite of the boss fights besides the final boss in the entirety of the game. I'm going to rank her S. I know she frustrates a lot of people. Her wall grab can be annoying, but I just like the whole aesthetic. I like going from outside in the cemetery to inside and everything that goes along with that boss fight. And because of that, I prefer that one in Losum to the boss fight of Farron and Phelan. So that's just a personal opinion. But again, I do like Farron and Phelan quite a bit as well. I think they are a fun boss fight. I do like the challenge, but I think it's mitigated a little bit in co-op because it's essentially just a big boss room. You have some swords coming down from the sky, all that kind of good stuff, which is fun, but obviously not going to be to the same level of interest to me as the Nightweaver. Then we have Gwendol the Unburnt. I think this is a solid boss fight. I don't think there's anything too crazy about it. The fact that it's just a person up there on the ledge is kind of hilarious to me. So that does increase it. I know the hitbox is pretty small for some people, so if you're running certain builds, it may not work as well. But I do like this boss fight a little bit, and I definitely would prefer to have this one mixed in when we have all these massive boss fights in the game. If all of our boss fights were just individual, like human-sized creatures, it wouldn't be nearly as fun. Then we get to the council. I don't enjoy this one as much as some other people. I think this one can be a little bit annoying at times, so that's why I'm going to rank it in the C tier. Then we've also got the Bloat King. This one is, again, in B tier. I think it's solid. I think it's good time when you're fighting it. There's an interesting layout of the boss room, which I like, but overall this one is one that I don't think is too crazy. Now, Master Doolin I like a lot. He reminds me of like an Elden Ring boss almost, and that's why I like fighting him. The only downside to him, I'm actually gonna drop it into B. There's a couple similar type of creatures out there in the world, so that kind of drags it down just a little bit because it feels like we were fighting mini versions of him throughout the game already, and then you fight him and it's like it's enhanced a bit but not really enough to separate it, so it just kind of feels familiar. Then we've got the Huntress. This is my favorite of the mini bosses, like the side bosses that are kind of out in the world. This is my favorite boss in the game for that specifically. Having to fight her a couple times. The first time she shows up, it's actually fantastic. It's out of nowhere. She's gonna kind of hunt you down essentially, and then you have to return the favor and go get her in her own section. So I like that quite a bit, and that's why I'm gonna rank her that a little bit higher there. Then we've got the Red Prince. This guy is interesting to me because this boss fight is very different depending on the difficulty level. If you're fighting him at Survivor, it can be pretty simple, but once you get into more difficulty levels, that's when the challenge really ramps up. I do like the challenge also of his alternative method of killing him, where essentially you have to stab him with the assassin's blade, because that's going to provide a different option and change up the boss fight quite a bit. So I do like that a lot. That's why I'm going to rank him in the A tier. Although at the highest difficulty tiers, fighting in that small area when he has the firestorm present can be incredibly frustrating. Now we have Shalhala. Now this may be controversial, but I don't like her boss fight as much as others. I like her design. I like the design of the Spectral Guardian, but I just don't care for the boss fight as much as I do some of the other ones, especially when when I first went to Nehrud, I took on Talratha as my boss fight, and I like his a lot better, especially the metaphysical. I think that's a very fun boss fight, and so that's why I'm going to drop it there. Actually, I'm going to move Shahala down here because I'm going to move the base version of Talrotha right there. Now, of the three, I prefer obviously the metaphysical Talrotha. I like the whole vibe, the space that we fight him in. I like the boss fight in general, and I think I just prefer it to the other two, which feel more similar to boss fights I've done before. Shahala is one that feels very familiar to me. I don't know why. I don't know what I would compare it to, but it does feel like a familiar boss fight that I've done in other games, where Talrotha Metaphysical feels a little bit more unique to me, and then base Talrotha is actually quite a bit of fun in my opinion. I do like it quite a bit, so that's why I'm ranking them in that order. Then we've got the Astropath. This one looks kind of crazy, but I don't really care for the boss fight itself. I'm not really a big fan of it, whereas the Custodian I actually kind of enjoy. This one can be a little bit rough at times, but I do like it quite a bit. And then the Primogenitor, again, this is one that I don't care for as much. You're essentially just shooting these floating whales they remind me of, and it's just not really my jam compared to some of the other boss fights in the game, and that's why it's ranked a little bit lower, even though again I enjoy every boss fight. And really I think it depends on a lot of factors when you're ranking these, not only what difficulty level you're on, but also the build you have when you go into the boss fights. Some of these boss fights I cleared easily on my first try across multiple difficulty levels just because I had the right gear equipped, and then other boss fights I really had to plan a little bit more, so that's why it's different there. So that's just a personal preference. So now we get to some of the other boss fights. We have the Corruptor. I think this one's interesting. I do like the concept in general. I like the alternative kill method as well, but there's a bit of frustration. It can feel a little bit janky to me at times. Whereas the Corrupted Ravager, just the nostalgia of that, having the multiple options to either let it eat the dough or not, let it. You can shoot the dough yourself. You can fight it or not. You can skip the boss fight entirely. I just like the whole thing, and I think that one is probably my second favorite of the world bosses that we will fight in the game. Personally, just again, part of that is nostalgia from the first game as well. Then we've got the Kaula's Shadow. Apologies if I mess it up. I like this boss fight a lot. I know some people hate it because of the water, but I do think it provides an interesting strategy that you have to kind of keep in mind. I also like the tentacles that you have to take out at times because it just feels like there's multiple parts to the boss fight, and some of the boss fights don't have that, so I do like that quite a bit. Same thing with Mother Mind. I actually like Mother Mind a little bit, but while I do like the vibe of Mother Mind and the arena overall, it can be frustrating. I feel like sometimes with Mother Mind, I do die at times to things that are beyond my control. Like if I'm playing in multiplayer, for example, it can feel like there's a little bit of a delay sometimes with some things where it leads me to die when I feel like I shouldn't, and that's the only frustration that I have with that, and I think that knocks it down a peg for me. Otherwise it would be in the A tier. And then we have Legion. Now for me personally, I don't like the Legion boss fight at all. It might be my least favorite in the entire game. I was able to do it with a random who was just dying over and over one time, which was funny, but ultimately it just feels inconsistent, and I just don't like it as much as some of the other boss fights. I think the hit registration on the weak point just feels janky to me. And again, I've taken this on in multiplayer a couple times, the co-op, so that may be why it feels that way. But even when I did it solo, I just didn't enjoy the boss fight as much as some other bosses that I've taken on in the game, so it gets knocked down a peg for me personally. Next up, we have one of my favorites as well. This one is very interesting to me because it's just a silly, once you get it down, once you master it, it's very simple. But the first time you do it, it's just so unique because it's not like a traditional boss fight. You're constantly running from the blocks that are trying to crush you. Seeing your friends, this is what raises it up for me too. Seeing your friends get crushed because it's their first time in there taking on the Sentinel is hilarious and will never get old for me. So as somebody who enjoys that fun level of that, that's why I prefer this boss fight, and I will always take my friends in there for the first time and just watch their reactions. That's also one of the reasons I do like the Kalos fight, because when they get grabbed by the ring, it just it gives me immense joy to hear them kind of be confused when they're sucked into another area of the map or whatever. So I do like that quite a bit. I think overall the Labyrinth Sentinel is an easy one once you get to the once you get down how it works and the rotations of the boxes that are trying to crush you and everything. But that doesn't matter. I still have a lot of fun with it. So now we're getting to the final world boss, the final boss of the game, Annihilation. This is, again, not going to be for everybody. I think it's very frustrating at times at higher difficulties and in co-op. This is the only thing. I was considering putting this down in A because it's so incredibly bullet spongy in co-op that is the most frustrating part. So I think this is a great design of a boss. I think it's very fun. I think it's very interesting. The second part to it is absolutely insane. Staying alive during that is very challenging, especially across higher difficulty tiers. But I do not like, and I think they're adjusting this in the future, how bullet spongy the final boss is when you're in co-op. When you're in co-op with another player and you're going through the game and it feels not crazy difficult, you're hanging in there, everything is going fine, and then you get to the final boss and it's like so tanky even on the lowest difficulty. That's a little bit of a problem for me. That's the only knock I have. Other than that, the design is great, the cutscenes around it are great, the multiple layers to it I think are very, very good. Teleporting back and forth, I like it quite a bit. I know not everyone's a fan, but that's just my personal preference. And now we're going to get to Cancer, Venom, and Bane. I'm going to be honest, all of these are solid but not spectacular boss fights to me. None of them feel as unique or fun as some of the other boss fights in the game. I'm ranking them all C. This may feel a little bit harsh, but that's just because I just feel like I prefer so many of the other boss fights. I think the whole root area is the drabness, I think, gets to me, and the root enemies that we're fighting just are not as much fun for me to fight as some of the other bosses. Like, I would much rather take on Kayla's Shadow, the Red Prince, and a lot of these other boss fights rather than the boss fights from the root Earth area. So that's just, again, maybe it might be a personal preference. Again, I think these are challenging bosses. I think they are fun bosses overall, but again, I think they're just the vibes are too similar, and that's why I'm going to knock them down a peg. So anyway, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What do you guys think of these rankings overall? My name is JoPa. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. It helps me out tremendously. Shows you want to see more Remnant 2 content from me going forward. I appreciate all the support lately. It's been absolutely amazing. I hope you have a good one, and I'll catch you all later.